So I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's event, Understanding the Conflict, Israel's War on Gaza. My name is Susan Pollock. I'm a professor in the Department of Anthropology here at Binghamton, and I'm the moderator for tonight's event. I want to say just a very few words about the purpose of the event to get us started, a few words about our panelists, and then I'll be turning the speaker over to them. The purpose of tonight's talk tonight's panel discussion is to be informative. That is, we've asked all of the speakers who have come here tonight, the 4 people who have agreed to be on this panel, to talk about the events of the last month or so in Gaza, in historical context, in broader context, in terms of what has been happening on the ground, and to provide a basis of information, perceptions, interpretations that may differ quite considerably from those that we hear on a regular basis in the news media. Okay. So the emphasis here is on information, informative engagement with the issues. And one of the things that I will insist on as a moderator is that this event be respectful. And when I say respectful, I mean that I expect all of us to respect each other and each other's views and opinions. We may disagree with them, we may ask questions against them, but I will insist that all questions and comments be held in a respectful tone. The format that we're going to follow is, as I said, we have 4 panel speakers, or hopefully 4. The 4th one is on his way from the airport as we speak. They will each be talking for 10 or 15 minutes. Following the 4 speakers, we'll then open the floor for questions and comments, and I'll say a couple words about the format of that when we get closer to the time. So let me begin by saying a few words about our speakers tonight. Our first speaker is going to be Nader, who is a peace activist and executive director of Westchester People's Action Coalition. She served as a consultant to the United Nations Development Program in the Gaza Strip and served for 2 years as a Fulbright Scholar in Tunisia. Our second speaker will be Professor Ali Mazrui, who is, of course, a professor here at Binghamton. Dr. Mazrui currently directs the Institute of Global Cultural Studies here at the university, where he's the Albert Schweitzer Professor of Humanities. Among his many positions include the Vice President of the World Congress of Black Intellectuals and a member of the Pan-African Advisory Council to UNICEF. Our third speaker tonight, also a member of our faculty here, is Professor Jonathan Karp, who is Associate Professor of History and Judaic Studies. He's written extensively on Jewish cultural and economic history and teaches courses on Jewish responses to Zionism. And our fourth speaker, who is, as I said, not yet here, but should be in the course of the next quarter of an hour or so, is Omar Badr, who is the executive director of the Massachusetts American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. He's a graduate of the University of Memphis Political Science program and earned his MA in International Relations and Comparative Politics. Tonight's event is organized and sponsored by the Binghamton Political Initiative, BPI, and co-sponsored by Amnesty International, the Middle Eastern Cultural Association, EMO-SAC, the Binghamton University Turkish Student Association, the Chinese Student and Scholar Association, the Sociology Graduate Student Organization, and the Global Music and Dance Society. So a pretty broad array of people who have co-sponsored this event. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the microphone over to our first speaker, Nader Khader, who is going to talk to us about her work with Westpac and other history of this conflict.
Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you to the students, the BPI, for organizing this event. It's extremely well attended, and I think it shows that there's a lot of interest in this issue. As Professor Pollock mentioned, I work for a peace and justice activist organization in Westchester County, which is just north of the Bronx of New York City in New York. And very important to mention both peace and justice, because very often in this work that I've been doing, the issue of peace and justice is very much an issue of oppressed and oppressor. a lot of the peace activists tend to be white folk who enjoy relative privilege. A lot of people who are looking for justice are people of color who do not necessarily enjoy this privilege. So it's very important that both this peace and justice go together. And in the 15 minutes that I have, I would like to say that I think the root of this conflict is very much a conflict over power status. There's one group of people who have no control over any aspect of their lives, and there's another group of people who has all the control, not only for their own community, but are exerting this power and control in a very unfair way against a whole other community. And that's the root of this conflict. And when we can start to have a situation where both peoples have the same status, the same power, the same level of respect, then the conflict will be close to being over. So this is very much a conflict about power relations. And that's an essential point. I also would like to start off by this whole notion of the Zionist project in Palestine. My mother is from Jerusalem. She was 6 years old when the State of Israel was created. And she was removed from her home in 1948 by Jewish militias in the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. Her whole family was removed at gunpoint. And that's my mother's experience with Zionism. So it's important for everyone in this room to acknowledge that in the process of creating the Jewish state in Palestine, hundreds of thousands of people who had been living in Palestine for hundreds of years were forcibly expelled from their homes. It's important for Zionists in this room to acknowledge that trauma as we acknowledge the trauma of the Holocaust, of the pogroms in Europe, of the Spanish Inquisition. We acknowledge that. And it's important for all of you to also acknowledge that the creation of the State of Israel was a trauma for hundreds of thousands of people living in Palestine. And that trauma has not been healed. And it has not been healed because the issue of refugees is unresolved. The majority of people who live in the Gaza Strip are not from Gaza. They are from Ashkelon, they are from Beersheba, they are from towns and villages which find themselves today inside the State of Israel. And that's a very important point when we talk about what happened recently in Gaza. You have a population that doesn't belong in Gaza. They're not from Gaza. Some of them are, historically, and have been living there for centuries, but many of them are not. And so you have this population of 1.5 million people basically trapped. They're not free to travel. Students your age cannot get to universities in Europe and America because they're not granted travel permits. I was in the Gaza Strip in 1999. In 1999, the quality of water was very poor. Children were suffering from kidney ailments. The elderly were suffering from kidney ailments because the level of salt in the drinking water in Gaza is very high. And what happened recently during the 4 weeks of bombing in January, the Israeli forces targeted the water treatment plant in Gaza. Now, this is a clear act of collective punishment. Who are you punishing when you bomb a water treatment facility? Are you telling me that you're targeting militants that are hiding in schools? Or are you targeting the whole 1.5 million civilian people who are already under siege, who are already malnourished? The levels of malnutrition in Gaza are very high. Unemployment is very high because people are not free to travel. It's very hard to imagine unless you actually experience it. And part of what we're trying to do this evening is to put ourselves in another person's perspective so we can understand what this conflict is all about. And it's very important to understand what conditions are like inside the Gaza Strip. You tell me the settlers were removed in 2005, the Jewish settlers in Gaza. Yes, they were removed. But the Gazan people are still under siege. The airport that they built was bombed because Israel wanted to give the message that we cannot allow you to behave as an independent state. We want you to remain dependent on us in all senses of the word. So really, the Palestinians have not been allowed to develop themselves autonomously, to express themselves, their self-determination, their aspirations, to live as any of you in this room would like to live, with dignity. The key word this evening is dignity. They have not been allowed to live lives of dignity. And that was the cause of the rockets, by the way. The cause of the rockets going into southern Israel was because food and water were not being allowed in. And it was a slow starvation. You can look at the reports coming out of the level of children with hearing problems from the sonic boom. 40% of children under the age of 15 have hearing problems because part of the tactic of collective punishment was to engage in these aerial sonic booms, which is very traumatic and causes hearing problems in people. The level of anemia is very high among the children. Mental disorders. Half the children in Gaza have lost the will to live. So how can Israel live in peace and security when they are festering this poverty and despair right at their border? How can that be in Israel's self-interest? To entrap, imprison 1.5 million people and treat them so poorly that they're forced to dig tunnels for food and water and basic essentials, goods and services, because the borders are closed. So that's the reality of the experience. It's extremely dehumanizing. And if you treat a community in a dehumanized manner over time, how are you going to be treated back? So what was the real objective of what happened recently in Gaza? The real objective was to remove Hamas from the Israeli point of view, was to remove Hamas as a representative of the Palestinian people, because the Israeli government doesn't want to negotiate with Hamas. They feel much more comfortable with Mahmoud Abbas, who's compromised so much that many Palestinians don't respect him anymore. They see him as a collaborator. The other thing I wanted to get back to, what I mentioned at the beginning with this connection to land. It's hard for us to understand traditional people's connection to land. You can say, well, the Palestinians were displaced in 1948 from their homes and villages, 700,000 or 800,000 of them. So let them assimilate in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria, in Egypt, in Gaza, and let them assimilate. Well, Palestine was a traditional agricultural society before Zionism. And the connection of traditional peoples to their land is very different from what mainstream America feels about land. In order to understand this relationship to the Palestinians that they feel towards their villages and towns, you would have to go up a few miles on 81 to the Onondaga Nation and have a conversation with the Onondaga people. What is their relationship to the land? In our Western capitalist society, it's a commodity for buying and selling. And in traditional cultures, the connection to the land is much deeper. It's sacred, it's spiritual. The Palestinian farmers tilled the land, the olive trees, the orange groves, the figs. It was a spiritual connection to the land. The land is like Mother Earth. It nurtures us. It takes care of us. It's not something that we buy and sell. So it's a very different relationship to the land. And that's something that needs to be brought into this discourse. Why are these refugees, 3 generations of refugees holding the keys to their homes, why are they still talking about the 1,200 villages and towns inside Palestine? Why can't they adjust living in their new homes in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria, and abroad in Europe? Why can't they just assimilate and get on with it? You know, Israel removed them. Israel created a Jewish state in Palestine, even though the Jews were not a majority of the population at the time that Israel was created. Why can't they just move on with their lives? Well, they have a different relationship to land. And for us to understand that relationship here in Binghamton, we need to go up and speak with the elders of the Onondaga and the Mohawk and ask them about their connection to the land and how it's different from our connection to the land, and learn something about traditional people's views. I have actually so much more to say, but time is very short. Maybe in the Q&A we can discuss more about it. If you are a Palestine solidarity activist, you are not against Israel and you are not against the Jewish people. A Palestine solidarity activist is a person who believes deeply in the human dignity of each and every person. A Palestine solidarity activist is a person who has a vision for this planet where every human being is treated with deep dignity and respect and is allowed to fulfill his or her potential in a world that protects the laws of all people equally. That's the vision. That's what's driving Palestine solidarity activists. It's not anti-Semitism, it's not anti-Israel. It's a vision of Israel where Israel treats all its citizens with full equality. Right now, the conversation in Israel is scary. With these recent elections, we have politicians in power, like Livni, like Netanyahu, who are speaking openly about denationalizing the 1 million Palestinian citizens of Israel and transferring them to whatever fragments remain of Palestinian land in the West Bank and Gaza, in order to maintain the Jewish purity of the state of Israel. And that's something that Zionist students in this audience must deeply consider. Yes, you may be attached to the state of Israel. You may have family living in Israel. But are you willing to support the perpetuation of ethnic cleansing in order to maintain the Jewish majority of the state of Israel? Does that sit well with you? Is that something you're comfortable participating in, supporting, funding, because it's so important for you that Israel remain a Jewish majority state? Is that your vision of where humanity is headed? Where we identify with tribes instead of identifying with universalism, with humanity, with universal declaration of human rights? This is a serious challenge for all people of conscience to think deeply about. So I would recommend this short book by Professor Ilan Pappé, who's an Israeli Jewish historian, very courageous. It's a short book if you want to go further into the origins of Israel. It's a highly readable book. It's called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And he documents what happened that led up to 1948 and beyond. And one last thing, the organization I work with is working hard at organizing a Lower Hudson Valley Social Forum. It's a coming together of different social justice struggles, immigration rights, economic justice, social justice. There will be a panel on boycott, divestment, sanctions, which I don't have time now, maybe in the Q&A, but it's a movement around the globe, feeling that the only way we can end the state of the apartheid state of Israel as it exists today, and to transform it into something much more benevolent for all its people, is to engage seriously in boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Hampshire College in Amherst is the first university to divest from 6 corporations that are profiteering from the illegal occupation of Palestinian land. University of Rochester Students had a sit-in challenging the university to divest from corporations that are benefiting, like Caterpillar. And I've just heard that Caterpillar apparently has a strong presence on campus here and is doing construction here. Caterpillar is one of the main corporations that manufacture these bulldozers that uproot, that demolish homes and that uproot trees. So that is one approach to pressuring the state of Israel as it exists today in its consumption of Palestinian land, its ongoing occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, because really the only thing now with the elections we've seen in Israel moving to the right, the only thing that can stop this movement in a negative direction and towards negotiations back to the negotiating table is pressure from the United States. And the Obama administration may not be able to exert that kind of pressure unless there's really a groundswell of support at the grassroots level. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Our next speaker is going to be Professor Ali Mazrui. I won't go through the introductions a second time, but rather turn this over to Professor Mazrui. So,
thank you very much. It's a good turnout, and I'm sure there won't be a riot. So, so all is well. Now, the distribution of the subject matter ideally should have been to deal with the roots of the war in Gaza, then the actual events of the war, and then an estimate of the consequences. In reality, mine is about an estimate of the consequences. So ideally, I should have been speaking last, but there was a good deal of negotiations as to who should go first, so I offered to go second. And I've lived in the United States long enough to know that Jewish culture in the United States is very liberal, and I have classes with many Jewish students, and we have civilized debates. But things are happening in Israel which are not remotely liberal, and some of the things I'm going to say today may be quite disturbing to many of you. But you should really be bracing yourself, because you are going to hear more and more of that kind of vocabulary from now on in relation to the Jewish people. That epithets never before applied to Jewish people are going to be increasingly applied in the media and in books because of what Israel is becoming. So Israel is reshaping the image not just of Israelis, not just the image of Zionists, but the image of world Jewry. And if the Jews of the world care about Israel and about their own reputation, it's no longer enough to say Israel can do no wrong, and if we have to criticize, let's criticize among ourselves and never in public. So who were the losers in the Gaza war on the eve of the changing of the guards in both Washington and Israel? The most tragic casualties were, of course, the people of Gaza, who were killed literally in their hundreds, men, women, and children. The next losers were the majority of Israelis, who supported one of the most inhumane conflicts, even by the standards of the Middle East. The Israeli army took full advantage of its superiority in range of weapons and its capacity to destroy, and managed to give real meaning to the concept of what others call state terrorism. More than half of the Palestinians killed were innocent civilians, many of them women and children, by all reports of independent newspapers in the Western world. The Nazis in occupied France in World War II used to threaten French villagers as follows: if you kill a single German soldier, we shall come and select at least 20 of you for execution. In the Gaza war, the Israelis outperformed the Nazis in occupied France. for every Israeli killed in the Gaza war, the Israeli war machine literally killed 100 Palestinians. That's not an exaggeration. It's literally the proportion. For every Israeli who died in this Gaza war, 100 Palestinians were killed. Indeed, some of the 13 Israelis killed were shot by fellow Israelis as a result of friendly fire. The Gaza war tarnished the reputation of Israel to a greater extent than almost anything else the Jewish state has ever done. In the Six-Day War in 1967 and in the Entebbe rescue raid in Idi Amin's Uganda, Israelis emerged as spectacular heroes. But in the Gaza war, the Israelis were seen worldwide as cruel military bullies, recklessly bombing the homes and schools of a relatively defenseless population. The third category of losers of the Gaza war are the Jews of the world. The latest war has been another trigger of new forms of anti-Semitism in the sense of Judeophobia in Europe, Asia, Africa, as well as the Middle East. When comparing anti-Semitism in the first half of the 20th century and the new anti-Semitism of this new millennium, a painful paradox emerges. In the first half of the 20th century, the Jews were unjustly hated for their creative talents. Universities like Harvard and Columbia in the United States had quota system for a number of Jews admitted because so many young Jews were intellectually successful and qualified for competitive vacancies. In European capitals, Jews were often envied because of their wealth and economic achievements. In Western high culture, like musical composition, opera, theater, literature, ballet, European Jews excelled out of proportion to their numbers. In the sciences, Jews won a remarkable number of Nobel Prizes. They still win a disproportionate number of Nobel Prizes. In the liberal professions of medicine, law, and academia, Jews were both admired and envied. The anti-Semitism or Judeophobia of those years was partly rooted in professional jealousies born out of Jewish creative achievements. Unfortunately, the anti-Semitism generated by Israeli militarism is born out of Israeli destructive power. Jews were once envied because they were creators of culture and exemplary in invention and innovation. Israelis are now hated because they excel in targeted assassinations and large-scale destruction of homes of their neighbors. The anti-Semitism of the first half of the 20th century was doubly unjust. It hated and destroyed Jews partly because they were innovative benefactors of the human race. The new anti-Semitism is a child of the brilliance of Israelis in annihilating hundreds of their neighbors collectively and sometimes murdering them one by one in their beds at home. Whatever Israel commits is sometimes forgiven by Jews abroad. And whenever Israel commits war crimes and crimes against humanity, as it has done by many estimates in Gaza, Israel narrows the moral distance between itself and the Nazis. When the Israeli military goes to the disproportionate degree of killing 100 Palestinians for every Israeli killed, the army is drifting towards what Professor Yeshayahu Leibovitz of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem once called Judeo-Nazism. He was editor of the Encyclopedia Hebraica and was warning fellow Israelis against giving meaning to such unthinkable concepts. As Israel is now producing literally racist political parties, disenfranchising Arabs, thinking of ethnic cleansing, initiating the first stages of domestic apartheid, as contrasted with what Jimmy Carter meant when he used the concept of peace or apartheid. Jimmy Carter was talking about how Israelis treated Palestinians outside Israel. Now we're moving closer to how Israelis treat non-Jews within Israel. This is domestic apartheid and not external. Is the concept Judeo-Nazism becoming closer and closer to realization? The first casualties of the Gaza war are Arab moderates in the Middle East, both in government circles and among intellectuals. It has become less and less respectable to regard Israelis as viable partners for peace. An influential Saudi prince, a friend of mine, we meet every year in Oxford because we're both members of the Oxford Board of Trustees of the Center for Islamic Studies. Prince Turk Al-Faisal wrote an unprecedented article in the Financial Times of London, warning the new administration in Washington, D.C., that Arab governments could no longer accept American indifference to reckless destruction of Arab lives. The United States added insult to injury when the United States Senate voted almost unanimously in support of what Israel was doing in Gaza. The House of Representatives had only about 12 members voting against the pro-Israeli resolution. The two Muslim members of Congress voted present instead of taking sides. The pro-Israeli atmosphere in Congress, in spite of the atrocities perpetrated by Israel, intimidated any honest congressman or senator from voting according to their conscience. It was one more example of Israel becoming increasingly a threat to American democracy. It has been a threat in several ways, including self-censorship by American media, staggering levels of self-censorship, terrified of having anything that says anything negative about Israel. It's far easier and safer in the United States to condemn the American government and Uncle Sam than to condemn Israel. It has been that for years, throughout my quarter century living in this country, that people have had their tenure canceled at universities because they express pro-Palestinian sympathies. I know of no person who has been denied tenure because he condemned the policies of Uncle Sam. And then recently they had 60 Minutes having an attempt at an incredibly balanced, incredible by American standard, an incredibly balanced portrayal of how Palestinians are treated by Israelis. And they receive terrifying numbers of protests to intimidate them from ever again attempting such balance later on. So in both academia and in the media, American democracy has been endangered by excessive Israeli philia, and is moving towards creating worldwide, unfortunately, dangerous Judeophobia. So I came here not to bring you good news, not to attempt to be polite, because that's the kind of self-censorship which has made Israel move further and further to the right, so that now people are beginning to use Israeli fascism openly. I came ready to tell you what I regard as the likely drift of opinion of both Israel and the Jews from now on. The words you have heard describing what is happening, you may have heard them for the first time from me or for the second time. I promise you, you will hear that kind of analysis more and more as Israel moved closer and closer to racism and apartheid. Thank you very much.
I'd like to turn the microphone over now to Professor Jonathan Karp from the Departments of History and Judaic Studies.
Okay, that's an impressive turnout. I'd like to begin by saying a few words about my presence on this panel. I was first approached by the organizers back in early January while the Gaza operation was raging. Amidst the horrors of that war daily reported in newspapers, I felt obliged to add my voice to those of others in condemnation of what I and many other Jews felt was Israel's excessive reaction to continuing Hamas rocket fire into southern Israel. I still feel this way. I see little evidence that the Gaza operation had the effect of weakening Hamas or curbing Iran, which were two of Israel's stated or implicit goals, as well as compensating for the disastrous 2006 Lebanon war. And yet the operation was extremely brutal and deadly. It's hard to imagine how it could not have been, given the density of population in Gaza and the type of weaponry and military doctrine that Israel employed. Now, it's quite true that Hamas had been firing rockets into Israel for a number of years. Rockets, I should add, not aimed at military but at civilian targets, or not capable of reaching targets with any precision because of their crudity. That Hamas is also responsible for numerous terrorist attacks on Israeli civilians, and that Hamas refuses to recognize the state of Israel as a Jewish state and is indeed committed in principle to its destruction. Hamas is Israel's enemy and should likewise be regarded, in my opinion, as an enemy by every person who professes liberal and humane values, no matter what their party political orientation or attitude is toward Israel itself. But even acknowledging this, I do not believe that Israel acted wisely or properly in pursuing war against this enemy. Even if we accept Israel's protestations that it regularly issued warnings to civilians to evacuate homes and buildings before bombing them, or that Hamas adopted a policy of hiding behind civilians, the operation was still brutal and excessive. The use of phosphorus bombs, the employment of a doctrine requiring troops to target civilians wherever they concluded not doing so could conceivably risk Israeli soldiers' lives. It is hard to see how such measures under the circumstances could avoid exacting a terrible toll, and they did not. As dangerous and intolerable as these Hamas rocket attacks have been, and I recognize that I say this from the safety of my own home very far away, they did not represent the kind of existential mortal threat that might have necessitated such a terrible response. It may not even be the case, and I don't think it is, that the government of Prime Minister Olmert, Foreign Minister Livni, Defense Minister Barak, succeeded, after all, in beating back the electoral threat of the Israeli far right through their military vigilance in Gaza, if that was one of their aims as well. So speaking personally, I thoroughly condemn Israel's attack on Gaza unambiguously, and as I condemn Hamas's rocket attacks and Hamas's ideology and aims. I feel no differently now than I did in January when I first received the invitation to speak. But when I accepted that invitation, I had assumed, perhaps naively, that at least one of the other panelists present would represent a position somewhat sympathetic to that of the Israeli government. I never imagined that that person would be me. Unlikely in my history. Nor do I think that the organizers had it in mind for me in any way to defend Israel's actions. I believe that I was invited because it was assumed that my own oft-stated position, highly critical of Zionism, would offer the perspective of a Jew, or better yet, a professor of Judaic studies, strongly opposed to Israel's policies vis-à-vis the Palestinians. Yet I confess to feeling distinctly uncomfortable doing so in this context. On the one hand, the truth remains the truth, wherever it is spoken, whoever speaks it, setting and context do not matter. On the other, if my position as a Jewish historian affords me some special moral authority on this issue, then it is the messenger and not the message that matters here. And with all due respect to the reputable scholars and activists sharing this stage, this setting strikes me as an ideologically lopsided one. I do know that, with some urging from me, the organizers made sincere efforts to elicit participation from the other side, so to speak. I commend them for doing so, and only regret the fact that they were unsuccessful. I regret it because too often I have attended such events where, despite the best efforts of the presenters, only two kinds of people appear to be present in the audience: those who attend in order to have their sense of moral righteousness affirmed by the speakers, and those who attend in order to denounce the event as hopelessly biased and unfair. And I've always wondered on such occasions whether the event changed anybody's mind, or whether it was simply a kind of rhetorical replication of the very conflict it was meant to address, with both sides remaining locked in hopeless stalemate, yet feeling invigorated by the ritual venting of emotion and rhetoric. Maybe this event will be different. Maybe my anxieties are exaggerated or misplaced, or maybe there is simply no better way to proceed, no alternative. Is there a way forward through debate, discussion, and deliberation? Even when it comes to the Gaza war, where I feel confident in assigning a preponderance of blame to Israel, one can find powerful arguments on both sides. Sometimes these two sides, while ostensibly speaking of the very same event, appear Rashomon-like to reflect entirely different dimensions of reality, different universes, in fact, the worlds of matter and antimatter. My point here is not to describe a curious phenomenon of political psychology, but to ask how we might transcend it in order to make progress and actually solve problems. And I'm willing to stipulate, for argument's sake, that one side may be completely right and the other entirely wrong, one purely good and the other thoroughly bad. I'm willing to stipulate this for argument's sake, but only so long as you in the audience are willing to stipulate that the side that is completely bad and wrong honestly thinks in its own mind it is completely right and good. Why should you be willing to do so? Why should you waste your time and effort engaged in such a silly exercise? Well, the reason is that you, the side of light and truth, of course, simply lack the power to make your position prevail through force, through votes, through letters, protests, propaganda, etc. You've tried and you simply cannot do it. The only thing left is to attempt patiently and gently to persuade the other side that it is in the wrong. It's true that if they're thoroughly evil, they probably don't care about being in the wrong. Why should it bother them so long as they get their way? But I would maintain that even bad people usually feel the need to believe that they are right. And there's something hopeful in this. It's the basic fact of human nature that gives us hope that they too, or we ourselves, can be psychologically vulnerable to correction and hence persuasion. Let me put it plainly. The stalemate is capable of being broken for one reason. You have the advantage over the other side, whoever you are. The advantage of knowing that they really, genuinely believe they're right. Knowing that the other side is convinced of its own righteousness requires us either to kill them or to try to understand them. Hopefully, only the latter. But in order to understand them, we must avoid certain common pitfalls. First, I would suggest that arguing from your own victimhood, however justified, is futile, since the other side is equally convinced that it is the side of the true victims. It's very hard to objectively measure degrees of victimhood. And even if you could quantify it on some scale, it wouldn't be of much help. The other side would only claim that it is the victim of a biased scale. So that's out. Arguing from history will also likely fail. And as a historian, I say this with some regret, since history can easily be made to serve a variety of ends, including opposing ones. The facts rarely speak for themselves. Even on matters where relatively little is at stake, historians rarely achieve consensus before they reach exhaustion. They don't reach consensus. They just move on out of boredom. And in moving on, once ferocious debates come to appear tired, and hence no longer a matter of serious dispute. That is when the facts really do appear to speak for themselves, since they become, in a sense, settled like dust. It's an arduous process and one not readily applicable to live political conflicts in which people are presently dying. All right, so if an assertion of victimhood and aggrievement cannot prevail, even when supported by a lengthy historical recounting of crimes and injustices, what more can we do? It seems to me that the only way out is for one side, naturally the good side, to ask itself why the other side is so convinced of the justice of its own position. In doing so, the good side will make a sincere effort to research the history of the bad side. This is where history can matter, while striving to ignore the latter's bad arguments. The goal is to discover what led the bad side to be in a position to come up with so many flawed arguments, arguments which may be forgiven if, despite their specious nature, the sentiment that produced them can be sympathetically understood. In fact, in the process of acquiring that sympathetic understanding and of relating the actual history of the bad side to the evolution of its arguments, those arguments will begin, at least, to appear explicable, if not convincing, and may even turn out to exhibit some small rational core. And understanding that small rational core of otherwise weak arguments can offer great insights into the otherwise perplexing mentality of our opponents. That at least is a start, a basis for progress in achieving a process of mutual understanding, of correcting the other side and correcting ourselves. In other words, most of us here are not direct combatants in this terrible struggle. True, on this very panel, we have individuals who have painstakingly and courageously sought to record human rights abuses in this conflict, an essential element in establishing an accurate record. But most of us view the conflict from a greater distance. We are sympathizers, allies, observers, sometimes, unfortunately, cheerleaders. At the same time, many of us reside in a university where, thank God, we have the leisure and security to pursue understanding. As a member of this community, I cannot help but believe that understanding of complexity, beyond black and white, the pure good and evil, will not compromise us morally, but may actually achieve the opposite, our elevation. And for that, we need to engage with the other side. Is it difficult? No one ever said it would be easy. Is it worth it? One might ask, with Hamas and Israel Beitenu increasingly triumphant, what more have we got to lose? Thank you.
Our last speaker this evening is Omar Bada, who has managed to get here despite delays in flights and so on. As a reminder for those of you who are not here, Omar Bada is the Executive Director of the Massachusetts American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, and is a graduate of the University of Memphis Political Science program, where he earned an MA in International Relations and Comparative Politics. So I'm going to turn this over to Omar, and following his talk, we will have open things up for question and answer.
Thank you very much for the introduction. A minor correction, former executive director, actually, up until very recently. I want to apologize for not being able to get here. I just had a hellish time, actually, flying in from Boston. Just the weather was a mess and a bunch of other things. And as part of that, I want to apologize for potentially repeating some of the things that have already been said. I was not fortunate enough to catch the earlier talks. But to talk briefly about the situation in Gaza, what we know is that on December 27th, Israel launched a massive assault on the Gaza Strip, something that was relatively unseen in a very long time in terms of scale. We have not seen that in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in decades, the pace of the killing that took place. As part of that, we know, because of Amnesty International, that residential and civilian areas were targeted. We know that the use of white phosphorus throughout residential areas was so extensive that Amnesty International actually called it a war crime. We know that UN food envoys were targeted, causing a cessation in those activities of humanitarian work for quite a bit. And we know that a UN school had also been hit. And we could go on and on listing those atrocities, but the outcome was the leveling of entire neighborhoods in the Gaza Strip, and a situation today where we have up to tens of thousands of people who are left without clean water. And the death toll that came out of this is 1,300 Palestinians dead, roughly 40% of whom are women and children, and over 5,000 injured, roughly more than half of whom are women and children. And on the other side, you have 3 Israelis who were killed by Hamas rockets, and you have 10 Israeli soldiers who were part of the invading army who were also killed. And if you want to zoom out a little bit to take a broader look at the scale, you'll notice that over the past 7 years before this crisis, Israel had killed actually thousands of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and that Hamas rockets had killed nearly 20 Israelis during that period, a number that Israel killed 10 times as many in a matter of minutes at the beginning of this invasion a few weeks ago. But this is not about proportion. I think this is a very important point to stress, is that it was really sad to see that the main criticism coming of Israel's actions were on the grounds that it was disproportionate. This is only a very minute part of the picture. The problem is actually Israel's narrative of the conflict, which was adopted wholesale by American media. And that narrative is Hamas fires rockets and Israel forced to respond. And when that's the equation, it doesn't really matter how many human rights violations you can cite, how many articles of the Geneva Convention and UN resolutions you can cite that Israel is violating. Most of us would have sympathy, basic sympathy, that if you're under attack, you have to respond in a way that stops those attacks from taking place. But this invasion was not really much about the rockets, and the evidence for that is the fact that a Haaretz article, Israeli newspaper, noted that the planning for this war had actually taken place more than 6 months before, quoting Israeli military officials and defense officials. The context that is missing is the context of the occupation. To give you a brief history, we obviously don't have time to go through it all here. Israel illegally occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip back in 1967. The United Nations declared the occupation illegal, as it is a standard principle of international law that land cannot be acquired by force, and called on Israel to withdraw from those occupied territories. In 1988, the Palestinians unilaterally renounced any Palestinian right to 78% of historic Palestine, which is to say, Israel proper. And that kicked off the peace process with the idea that Israel was going to gradually withdraw from the occupied territories to facilitate the creation of a Palestinian state. Now, the only problem is that at a time when Israel was supposed to be withdrawing, Israel did the exact opposite, indeed accelerating the rate of settlement expansion throughout the occupied territories and solidifying its control over them. And that's why the peace process failed. The number of settlements doubled during this period. And then you've had the so-called Gaza pullout, in which, in a public relations stunt, Israel withdrew 8,000 settlers out of the Gaza Strip, at the same time sent 14,000 settlers more into the West Bank, and of course it's illegal for settlers to be there, and did not really end the occupation of the Gaza Strip, though, despite pulling its settlers out. It maintained complete control of the Gaza Strip, its airspace, its seashores, every point of exit and entry, and began systematically making the life of Palestinians there very difficult. And after the election of Hamas, it became even more so. The siege was so suffocating that unemployment was over 50%. You had over 80% of households dependent on food aid, on UN aid. And you've had lack of access to medical care that has caused the deaths of over 262 people during the time that the siege was in place up until this invasion. And I think that's really the context that we should be aware of. And then came the ceasefire. And I think it's really important to note is that we always assume, it almost goes without being challenged ever, that it is Hamas that violated the ceasefire, when this simply does not stand to scrutiny. I encourage you all, those of you who have access to the internet when you get home, to plug in and search for 7 violations of the ceasefire UN. Just enter those into Google. And you'll notice that Yediot Ahronot, an Israeli newspaper, had reported, quoting the UN, that Israel had violated the ceasefire 7 times in the very first week, and that those violations, most of them had taken place before any Palestinian rockets were fired. But despite these violations, and despite both sides on occasion breaking the ceasefire agreement, the ceasefire more or less held up until November 4th, on the eve of Barack Obama's election, when Israel launched a massive strike in the Gaza Strip, killing half a dozen Hamas militants, and then Hamas retaliated with rockets, and now Israel uses these rockets as the reason why this invasion must take place. So the proper equation is not Hamas fires rockets and Israel forced to respond. The proper equation is really Israel telling the Palestinians, we are going to occupy your territories, we're going to take your water, we're going to build settlements on your land, we're going to commit human rights abuses, and we're going to bomb you on occasion. Now you have the option of passively accepting this, or you have the option of retaliating with violence, rockets, or any other means that you find suitable. And then when you do that, we're going to massacre you in much larger numbers, and then we're going to blame you for it. That's really the equation that we're operating under here, and I think that's the context that is often missing. And when the Palestinians are offered a choice between surrender while their society is being destroyed, and between going and that as one option, and the other option being going down as martyrs fighting back with whatever they have, it's obvious that they're going to choose the latter, as much as you and I might dislike the fact that that happens to include acts of terrorism that are absolutely condemnable by anyone. What we have to offer them is an alternative to these two choices. It's not the destruction of Palestinian society through Palestinian surrender or the resort to violence, and that brings on even more violence onto Palestinians. We have to make sure that we pressure Israel into a fairer policy that includes withdrawing from the occupied territories so that peace can actually happen in that region. Now, why did Israel carry out this military assault during that time? I think there are multiple reasons. One is restoring the deterrence issue. After its relative defeat on the hands of Hezbollah in 2006, the view of the Israeli military had been shaken in the Arab world, and there was a sense that people were not afraid of them anymore. And so you needed to commit another large-scale level violence in order to reassert yourself. And Gaza was a significantly easier target than Lebanon. It's flat. You have this entire population put essentially in a cage, starved near to death, no access to the outside world, and with cooperation from the Egyptian government to make sure that nothing goes in and out of that border. And so it was a much easier target, and they did succeed in terms of asserting their power. And we saw that in the scale of violence that the Palestinians could not respond to in any way. The other aspect of it is, and we've seen this before, is because Israel wants to change the conversation away from ending the occupation. Hamas had signaled repeatedly that it's willing to accept the international consensus of a two-state solution, which might be news to most of you, I imagine, because we don't really get good coverage of this here. And in response, it was important to divert the issue, to change the conversation, because for that to have come out and for it to be moved to the forefront, that Hamas, like the rest of the Arab world, accepts normalization of relations with Israel in return for an end to the occupation, Israel being interested in keeping the West Bank primarily and continuing to build settlements there as we speak, a good way to change that conversation is to push Hamas through further rejectionism by attacking the Gaza Strip. And this is a standard policy, that whenever you attack someone, you push them further towards extremism, and whenever you talk to them, you moderate them and push them closer towards a political settlement. And the timing was also important. There were domestic Israeli elections where Bibi Netanyahu, the right-wing candidate, was ahead in the polls. And so the Kadima party, with the assistance of Ehud Barak, felt that a way to cut into that lead is to show that they too are capable of massive violence against the Palestinians. And there was the issue of the US elections, which was perhaps more significant. And I think that if you go to the Daily Show website and look up Mall Gaza, Jon Stewart's coverage of this was actually kind of interesting, and I think it's worth your time. There was a sense in Israel that we're not sure how Barack Obama is going to react to further future Israeli violence, so you might as well go out and get it out of the way while we know that we have a blank check from the Bush administration. And why does this matter to any of us is really what the question is, as opposed to just an analysis. The reason why it matters to us here is that Israel is the single largest recipient of US foreign aid. receiving roughly $3 billion every year. It's a total of $30 billion over this decade. And it's also a fact that the United States has blocked over 42 UN Security Council resolutions that are critical of Israel. That's greater than the number of all vetoes cast by all other permanent members of the Security Council combined on all issues, which tells you something about how obscene this relationship is. And while the last speaker, I apologize, I haven't caught his name, had mentioned that we are sometimes sympathizers or critics or cheerleaders, I suggest that we have a very different relationship to this conflict. We are actually participants in this conflict through our tax money. And given the fact that we live in a semi-functioning democratic society, it is really our responsibility. It is absolutely our responsibility as people of conscience and as citizens who are contributing to this to demand a suspension of US military aid to Israel until Israel abides by international law and respects human rights. And the broader point is here, this is part of a global issue. This is a much broader issue. I mean, there are so many other things that come into it. A stable Middle East is in US strategic interest as well. It's not only a moral responsibility. And I guess we can talk about other things as the discussion goes on. Thank you very much.
A couple of announcements and a couple of ground rules before we get started. One announcement, I forgot one of the co-sponsors of this event, which is the Muslim Student Association of Binghamton. Now, in terms of our procedure at this point, I want to reiterate what I said at the very beginning of this event, which is that I would ask that everybody be respectful. You're all welcome to ask whatever questions you want or to introduce information you feel was not presented here, but to do so in a manner that is respectful of everyone else in the audience and of the panelists themselves. Without further ado, I will turn this over to the audience and ask for questions.
My question is for Nader Khader. She made two statements. One, denigrating the government in the West Bank and implying that Hamas is legitimate and the proper ruler of Gaza, and that they're there legitimately. The second is she didn't acknowledge there was a border between Gaza and Egypt, and why doesn't Egypt help the Palestinians in Gaza?
Thank you. That was a very good question. The question, for those of you who didn't hear it, was that in my opening remarks, I made it sound like Hamas was a legitimate representative of the Palestinian, and I also did not refer to the border that the Gaza Strip shares with Egypt and Egypt's responsibility. Was that correct? Yeah. So the first question, there were democratic elections in the Palestinian territories 3 years ago. And overwhelmingly, the Palestinian people living in the West Bank and Gaza Strip voted in Hamas and voted out Fatah, which is the party of Mahmoud Abbas. Now, our whole mantra with our US relationship in the Middle East and part of the justification for invading Iraq, we're spreading democracy. We're invading because we're bringing democracy to these Arab people. Well, when there's elections, you need to respect the outcomes of the elections, whether you appreciate the platform or not. That's what democracy is. So really, otherwise we're giving the message to the people in the world, you can have elections, but you have to vote for people who we like, who we can control. So Hamas, and I have to disagree with Professor Karp, Hamas represents a culture of resistance for people under a brutal military occupation. And yes, they have engaged in actions. Their crude rockets cannot be directed. They don't have the sophisticated weapons that Israel has, thanks to our $3 billion in aid a year, in military aid to Israel. They don't have those weapons. So the rockets into southern Israel are violations of international law because you cannot direct the rockets. You don't know where they're going to end up. But Hamas is the legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people. And as Omar just mentioned, they were willing to accept a permanent truce with Israel. Second question, I don't want to take up too much time. Second question, well, what about Egypt? Egypt has a border with Israel. Well, Egypt is the second largest recipient of US aid. And we are propping up a regime in Egypt that is brutal, that has a horrendous human rights record, that is not legitimate. And Hosni Mubarak feels threatened. He doesn't want Hamas to thrive. Hamas has close ties with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. The Arab peoples on the street see the Egyptian government as complicit with the crimes of the State of Israel, of the Zionist state. And also, Israel is controlling the border with, even though it's Egypt and Gaza, Israel still controls that border. And that's what we mean when we say the Gaza Strip is under siege. There are trucks and trucks of humanitarian aid, food, water, medical supplies, stuck at doctors, American doctors who went to Gaza, stuck at the border because Israel would not let them in. Israel effectively controls the border between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. And in fact, that was part of the arrangement when Israel pulled out of the Sinai Peninsula. Part of the arrangement was that they would have control over that border into the Gaza Strip.
The people here who were able to see this are people who wanted to know what was really going on or wanted to gain more information on the conflict. But I want to know, because you're talking about how so many people are blacklisted for showing even a little support to the Palestinians, how do we get this kind of information out to the masses of Americans who really believe that the Palestinian government is really wrong and Israelis really justified in what they're doing?
We are beginning to see a shift in public discourse in this country. A former president, Jimmy Carter, came out with a book criticizing Israeli apartheid. You have relatively mainstream American politicians like Mearsheimer and Walt, who are primarily concerned about U.S. power in the world, who are coming out and criticizing the Israel lobby's influence. You have 60 Minutes putting together an excellent show just a couple of weeks ago on settlement expansion in the West Bank. And as I mentioned earlier, there's the Jon Stewart show's coverage of what's happening in Gaza. This is beginning to move closer and closer into the mainstream. I mean, the argument on the other side is not winnable anymore. In order for the so-called pro-Israel argument to fly, they have to convince you that the United Nations knows nothing about international law, that Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch know nothing about human rights, and that every major political figure in the world who's famous for human rights, from Desmond Tutu to Arun Gandhi to Nelson Mandela to Jimmy Carter, all are not really concerned about human rights. That's what it takes for them to win the argument. And I think since we're beginning to see that shift in public discourse, this is really an opportunity for us. It is up to you and me to make sure that this shift continues. And it's in activism, it's in organizing, it's in writing letters to the editor, it's in calling your media when you see coverage that you don't like. These are the kinds of things that it takes to shift this discourse further.
So my question is for Ms. Nader Khader. You mentioned that the refugee issue was the main issue involved, and you claim that Palestinians have been there for hundreds of years, and that's partially true. However, there were also Israelis. But what I want to talk about also is that the UNRWA Charter also has a provision that states that Palestinians that were there for only 2 years, people who came in and were there for only 2 years and were then displaced, are also included as refugees. Now, they were not there for 100 years, but only 2. How are they considered, more part of the land as the same people who were there for 100 years?
Refugees is definitely a core issue in this conflict. And myself, as a Palestinian, I would be extremely uncomfortable. And in fact, that's part of why Hamas has become popular, because it was clear that Fatah was willing to compromise too much of our basic integrity as a people. But the issue of refugees is crucial. And part of the founding Zionist myth, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, is Palestine is a land without a people for a people without a land. Exactly. Thank you. I thought I got it mixed up. So the question, you were suggesting that people actually came into Palestine once the European Zionists started turning it green. Well, you can read documentation. That is not what happened in Palestine. There were communities in place. Ilan Pappé, the book that I mentioned to you, is an Israeli Jewish historian. 1,200 villages all over Palestine. The Zionists were very clear. There's no place in Palestine that is not inhabited. It was inhabited all over, small villages, towns, cities. Tel Aviv is built on the destruction of 6 Palestinian villages. So this notion that people came in from outside, the Arabs came in from outside because they saw the Europeans were turning it green, this is a myth, and it's been proven a myth. So I don't know if that sufficiently answers your question, but from the Palestinians that I know, and there are 10 million Palestinians in the world today, I don't know anyone who calls themselves a Palestinian who came in from Jordan or Syria or Egypt or, no, the Palestinians that I know and that I've spoken to have their roots in the land. And that is the crux of the conflict. And that the Zionists need to acknowledge that a tremendous injustice happened in the creation of the State of Israel. And if you want to move forward in a peaceful manner, how do you correct this injustice from 1948? How do you correct that in a way that is fair for all the peoples involved in the conflict? And that is something to think about.
So Israeli citizens in rocketed areas such as Sderot have about 15 seconds warning before a rocket falls. On the contrary, leaflets are dropped by IDF as well as phone messages well in advance, hours in advance. How do you explain this disproportionate action?
Amnesty International says that there's nowhere to run in the Gaza Strip. So dropping off leaflets at people and telling them to escape while you have them in a cage before you shoot them is not exactly particularly humane in my view. Now, again, there's no question that Israel has the right to defend itself from the rockets that are flying onto Sderot. In fact, I would say that Israel is obligated to defend itself from those rockets. But when you're an occupying power, the way that you defend yourself is by seizing your aggression against the other side. I mean, it's really simple. You can look back at, there was terrorism among US patriots who were, quote unquote, hiding among civilians against the British Empire, fighting for the US Revolution. And there is a way to resolve that. There is a way to end that terrorism. The terrorism is indeed real, but the way to end it is by ending your aggression, which resolves the conflict, as opposed to waging even further military action against the oppressed population in order to end those rockets.
Professor Nader mentioned about attacks on water supplies in that region. And as far as I know, the main water supply is the Jordan River. So I was wondering what the water share percentage is on the Jordan River between Palestinian people and Israeli people. And I also want to know about the connection between the Jordan River, the main water supply, and the conflict between Palestinian people and Israel. Thank you.
I did mention that the water treatment facilities were bombed in the Gaza Strip. And water, fresh water, is very precious in the entire Middle East region. It's a very arid topography. And a lot of this conflict is over who controls the resources. Going back to the Zionist movement and the early Zionists who came from Europe and these 1,200 Palestinian villages before the creation of the State of Israel, if you read in the documentation of the early Zionists, they thoroughly researched each and every one of these villages. And they researched the aquifers in these villages. They researched the fertility of the land in these Palestinian villages. They knew what they were looking for. They wanted the best land with the freshest supply and the largest quantity of water. And that's where they chose to move the Zionist forces into. They knew what they were doing. It was you can read go back and read the history. In the 1930s, very careful documentation of these villages. So the Zionists wanted the most fertile land in Palestine with the largest aquifers. In the Gaza Strip, when there were 7,000 settlers living there, in a strip with 1.5 million people, 7,000 Jewish settlers, they had access to the majority of the freshwater supply. They had swimming pools, they were keeping their lawns green, and when I was in Gaza in '99, when the settlers were still there, people were forced to drink salt water because the fresh water supplies were being funneled to the illegal settlers in the territories. So this is a conflict over water, over who gets to control the water.
Interesting side note to the issue of water is the root of the barrier that Israel is currently building in the West Bank. Is that in addition to annexing major settlement blocks, most of virtually all of Jerusalem, the other thing that it goes around is the water aquifers. And while we're on this topic, just mentioning real briefly about the barrier, the reason why the barrier is illegal is because it is built within Palestinian territories, and with the very specific purpose of taking over the most significant arable lands, water resources, and so on. So that's, to bring it back to an example on a human level, if you want to build a fence between you and your neighbor, you build it between your backyard and your neighbor's backyard. If the fence that you build goes around your backyard, your neighbor's swimming pool, then it becomes clear that you're actually interested in acquiring that swimming pool. So the issue of water and the barrier is very related in this sense as well.
6 days ago, the United Nations Relief Works Agency suspended humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip because Hamas stole supplies that were intended to go directly to the Palestinian people in need. Do you think that the average Palestinian citizen living in the Gaza Strip could publicly criticize the Hamas leadership without fear of being harmed?
There are varying degrees to which life under Hamas is pleasant. So there are instances in which weddings have been crashed. I mean, it's for me personally, as a secular progressive person, I would not be particularly happy living under Hamas, generally speaking. But that's a wider problem. I mean, how safe is a Palestinian who's active against Israeli occupation of the occupied territories? How safe are Arabs in random Arab nations where you have these dictatorial regimes that are supported by the US? It's a much broader question. But on the issue specifically of the food being stolen, this has been a mantra that was repeated over and over by Israel's apologists throughout the war. And the first instance of this taking place was on February 3rd, this month, just a few days ago. It did not happen throughout the war, and as soon as it happened, Hamas came out and apologized the next day when it found out that its militants had actually stolen that food and promised to return it. That was the single first incident that this had actually taken place. And at a time when defenders of Israeli propaganda on this particular issue were repeating these lies, UN officials kept repeating that there is absolutely no evidence of this during the war. So there was one incident, and it took place just a few days ago on the 3rd.
I'd like to ask everyone on the panel what positive ideas you have for creating a two-state solution, because what I see here is this is really a polemical situation. You talk about the refugees from 1948 without mentioning the fact that Israel was invaded and was under siege. You talk about the occupation in 1967 without mentioning the fact that Israel was invaded. And you talk about how wonderful it was for Jewish creativity, but it didn't forsake 6 million Jews. And having a nation state might give them a little bit more security, and to equate that, the Israeli move to the right under fear, which I'm not supporting the Israeli move to the right. I did support the American move to the right and the things that we did, but I don't consider myself a Nazi, and I don't consider the Israelis a Nazi. I'm asking Israel to self-destruct. What positive programs you outline that could actually create a two-state solution? And I would ask specifically for you to suggest how one could get the Palestinians to stop their civil war so that there would actually be a Palestinian voice to smack to.
Let's see. This is really entertaining. So, in 1948, worth noting, I mean, I don't know, do you want me to answer each one of these points, or do you want to stick to the two-state solution part?
I really like, if you want anything positive here besides fundraising for the Palestinians, which I don't object to, but I would like some positive direction from this body.
Try this for a positive direction.
To a mess in the Middle East, to a two-state solution which would give security and dignity to both sides.
Allow me to suggest the following. Let me repeat something I mentioned in my talk earlier. In 1988, the Palestinian Authority unilaterally renounced any Palestinian right to 78% of historic Palestine, and that kicked off the peace process with the idea that Israel was going to withdraw from the occupied territories to facilitate the creation of a Palestinian state. Only Israel did the exact opposite during the peace process, doubling the number of settlements, continuing to build settlements in those occupied territories as you and I are speaking right now, in effect systematically undermining the two-state solution. Now, there was an authority that ruled the Palestinians that explicitly recognized Israel, and this is what Israel's response was, systematically undermining the two-state solution. Now, you currently have a Palestinian leadership in Hamas that is conditioning recognizing Israel on a full Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories. You have the entire Arab League in 2002 and again in 2007 presenting Israel with a proposal not only of a peace agreement with Israel, but a full normalization of relations with Israel. Israel rejected both offers. Every year in the United Nations General Assembly, the entire world votes on the two-state solution that is conditioned on Israel withdrawing from the occupied territories. Every year the vote is the same. The entire world is on one end, in excess of 150 countries, and on the other end is the United States, Israel, and a couple of minor countries in the Pacific Island. The solution is there. It's pretty straightforward. Nobody's disputing it. So it's just an issue of getting Israel to stop building more settlements and withdrawing from the occupied territories and allow for the two-state solution to exist. That's the problem.
Can I say something? There are conflicting directions that have been expressed on this panel and in this room about a solution, as there are in Israel, as there are amongst Palestinians, as there are amongst politicians and activists. There are those who support the two-state solution, which has long been the mainstream approach, and there are those who support a one-state solution. That is to say, the evolution of Israel into a secular democratic state, which used to be the position of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And what does that mean, a secular democratic state? It means, in theory, a liberal state, a state which is not Jewish, which is not Muslim, which is not Christian, a state somewhat modeled on Western liberal democracies that don't have a religious component to membership or an ethno-religious component to membership. And that's a very interesting idea, and I think I heard you alluding to that earlier. Now, one of the difficulties here is that the fear on the part of Jews who when you talk about the fear of the growing Arab population in Israel, the fear of this one-state solution is simply that it will become ultimately an Arab and Islamic tyranny for a Jewish minority. And that, I think, is a rational fear. I don't think it's a lunatic fear. I think it's a far-fetched fear at this point because Israel controls the situation politically and militarily. But the question, when you talk about Hamas as a cultural movement, a movement of the oppressed, a movement of social solidarity, but it's also an Islamist movement, okay? And when you say that you probably wouldn't feel that comfortable living under a Hamas government. It doesn't really fit in with your secular liberal notions, but nevertheless, you can understand why people preferred them to Fatah. You didn't say exactly that, but you said something along those lines. It all sounds very mild and very moderate and very gentle. And there's a short distance between liberalism and Hamas Islamism. But there isn't. There's a huge gap between those two sides. Now, I happen to believe that Israel's policies from the beginning have fostered the growth of Hamas, and that Israel initially did this, my belief, could be wrong, but that Israel did this quite deliberately. There's evidence to suggest that. But nevertheless, what I was talking about before about the problem of dealing with history, yes, history is important, but we have to understand the situation right now. And the situation right now is one in which we have Islamism growing in the Middle East, growing in other parts of the world. I think it's a complicated phenomenon, not a singular phenomenon, but it has a very dangerous components to it. And consequently, to blame, even if the United States policies and Israel's policies were originally, and I don't believe this to be true, responsible for the development of Islamism, it has taken on a life of its own. And one of the things that is missing from this panel, I would suggest, is a presence of somebody who could speak meaningfully and critically about the growth of Islamism, not simply as a consequence of American imperialism, but as a consequence of much more complex indigenous factors. There is a lack of complexity in the analysis here, in my opinion, as I said in my remarks.
There's a serious risk in treating Islamism as a dirty word, and that the trend towards greater consciousness of Islamic identity we are facing a world scene in which there are two countries, Iraq and Afghanistan, occupied partly by the United States and its allies. We have large chunks of what used to be Palestine held by Israel and held with levels of brutality. I don't want to call them Nazi either, but if you kill 100 people because one of your own is dead, you are inviting that kind of adjective. That is not just moving to the right. And thirdly, it's a situation where Muslims are sinned against. Large parts of the Muslim world are under some kind of military occupation. And Islamism, if by that you mean politicized Islam or radical Islam, is partly an outgrowth of a sense of siege by an important civilization on the world scene. And one major factor generating considerable anger and unfortunately hatred is the behavior of Israel.
So it's Israel's fault.
Two of them, the United States on one side as an aggressive superpower, and Israel as a smaller country, superpower in the region, but behaving in ways which are inhumane and brutal. So this does give rise to the radicalization of Islam. And then to say, therefore, we must understand Israeli caution because having aroused Muslim anger and Muslim rage, and now I can use that rage as a reason not to make compromises. I don't follow that logic.
That wasn't my logic.
I just wanted to briefly say that when I hear, at this point in time, with the facts on the ground, with the way that Palestinian territory has been fragmented, when I hear the term two-state solution, what I understand that to mean is a permanent oppression of the Palestinian people, a permanent second-class degraded status of the Palestinian people, a permanent sort of similar to undocumented people in this country, and to make that permanent. So that was not your intent. How can we move forward? I would love to see Israel have a constitution, first of all, that guarantees full equality for all its citizens. That's a step in the right direction. I would like to have Israel declare its borders. It's frightening for Palestinians to be living so close to a state that has never publicly said what its borders are. The municipality of Jerusalem has at least 200,000 Palestinians living there who are not allowed to vote in municipal elections. They have no rights. They never get building permits to expand their homes. If they build a home without a permit, it's demolished. Within the municipality of Jerusalem, 150 homes every year are demolished, Palestinian homes, because Palestinians living in Jerusalem are never granted permits to build. This injustice cannot go on forever. It cannot go on forever. So, in good faith, I'm very willing to move forward. But I'm not willing to live as a second-class citizen. I'm not willing to live as someone who has less status or less power than any other person. It's a question of self-respect. It's a question of dignity. So we can talk about a federated state. We can talk about a Palestinian territory, but it must be fully self-determined, fully autonomous, with equal status. And I'm not willing, as a human person, to accept anything less.
I have two questions. I have one, I'm sorry, I'm not good with names, but to the first lady that spoke and one to the last guy that spoke. Who spoke first, I have a question. You're talking about the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Israel. I'm just very confused about this because last time I've been to Israel, there were Arabs walking around the streets all over Israel, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, everywhere. But the last Jew that I've seen that by mistake ended up in a Palestinian territory got lynched. So I'm just very confused about that. And the second one, you guys are talking about occupied lands and that this land used to be Palestine. But I don't remember ever seeing in any history book ever a place called Palestine, an actual country. I've never seen a single, nothing. Actually, the land that was taken in the 67 war was taken from Jordan and from Egypt. And if you're going to talk about two states, then when the British took over Palestine in 1917, then they did make two states. The first state was an Arab state, which is now called Jordan, then called Transjordan, that was created in 1923. And the second state I see is Israel. There's an Arab state and a Jewish state. The Arab people that live there and the Jewish people that live there.
So you're basically saying that you would like to see the West Bank and Gaza incorporated into the state of Israel, from what I hear you say. If that's so, fine, but then you need to treat all people living within that territory as equal human beings. And if you want to go that route, that's comfortable with me, but then we have 5 million Palestinians living inside Israel, and we have 5 million Jews living inside Israel. So then we have a bi-national state, and then I tell you, let's get ourselves a constitution, and let's treat everyone with the same respect and apply all the laws with equality and with fairness and with the dignity that every human being deserves.
So, on the last question on the part, you had essentially a two-part thing. On the occupation and on the existence of Palestine and the ethnic cleansing and all of this, I'm a little confused. I don't know how seeing an Arab in Israel is evidence that 700,000 Palestinians were not ethnically cleansed from what became Israel. This is a fact that is acknowledged even by Israeli historians. If you read Shlomo Ben Ami's book, he's the Israeli foreign minister under Ehud Barak in 2000. His book, Scars of War, Wounds of Peace, talks explicitly about the driving out of 700,000 Palestinians from what became Israel. So that fact is not controversial. Now, the idea that the last Jew that you saw on Palestinian territory was lynched is simply false. It's a fabrication. It's just an idea that has absolutely no relationship to reality whatsoever. The number of Jewish peace activists that I personally know who go to the Palestinian territories on a regular basis, I can't stop counting. I can't even count all their names. They're all there. And then you have all the settlers who live in the occupied territories. Obviously, they're not welcome. But if they choose to live the way the peace activists live, if they choose not to steal the locals' territory and water and so on, they would be welcome as well. It's not an issue about Jew versus non-Jew. It's something very specific about people being robbed of their land and resources. That's the issue. And about the existence of Palestine or occupation, I did not invent those terms. They're there. The United Nations says the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are illegally occupied, and Israel was forced to withdraw from them. So you accept the UN when it creates Israel out of thin air, but when it says Israel must withdraw from the occupied territories, all of a sudden that becomes illegitimate? I mean, there's just seems to be a double standard there.
Just want to add quickly, I don't think it's uncontroversial to say that Israel expelled 700,000 Palestinians in 1948, 1949. I think that there are historians. Look, I'm not going to, for those on the other side, you're not going to be happy with this answer either. There are historians. Ilan Pape is not the only historian of 1948. I mean, just to say to read one book is not sufficient. There are 10 books that you should read. And I can put a list up and send it out to you. Books on, but the point is, there was a plan. There were deliberate expulsions on a widespread scale of Palestinians. There's no question about it. And every reputable Israeli historian recognizes that. But numbers can be important, even though we don't like to argue about them sometimes. It seems crude to argue, was it 600,000, was it 500,000? The consensus, if there is a consensus, the mainstream consensus is about 300,000. And there were others who fled for natural reasons that people would flee a war zone. Hey, I would have gotten the hell out too if there was a war going on. The point is that they weren't allowed to return. The point is that they weren't compensated. It's not just the ethnic cleansing, if you will. It is the failure to allow them to return, the failure to compensate them, the failure to acknowledge the responsibility in 1948 for being the principal instrument creating this refugee crisis. There, I totally agree.
I guess I could argue about numbers, but I don't really see the point. I don't think it's an important issue in the broader context.
Hi, Professor. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. I came in a little bit late. But one of the things that you said that stuck with me was that we need to understand how the other side works, and we need to be able to empathize with each other, so to speak, if we are to get to some sort of solution. But as I sit here listening to all the panelists speak, and I sit here listening to all the questions that are being raised, it seems as if every time someone refers to the other side, there's this demonization that comes along with referring to the other side. And my question is, if we in an academic institution, if we sitting here trying to figure out some sort of solution or trying to come to some sort of understanding, can't even eliminate that demonization in our discourse, how do we expect the people who are more deeply involved to actually come up with a real solution?
It's wonderful. Thank you. That's a wonderful question. First of all, I think it's very, very difficult. I don't want to pretend. I don't want to engage in a kumbaya kind of illusion. And you know, passions run high because people are suffering terribly. Passions run high for a lot of reasons, but that's certainly a legitimate reason. I do think that I have to mention, if he doesn't mind mentioning Andrew Epstein, who organized this event. I don't have to tell the whole world that I have the greatest admiration for Andrew. I think he's a wonderful guy and a very conscientious person, and I admire his activism, and I appreciate him putting together this panel. But we had a disagreement when he told me the constitution of the panel, and I said, get somebody, you know, who on the other side, as I said, or some kind of expert, you know, specialist. That's far from what I am, who might refute or contradict. Now, the reason is, you could very well say, just to give an analogy, should we, every time we talk about the Holocaust, should we have a Holocaust denier come and represent the other side, to give an extreme analogy? No, of course not. But nevertheless, That is a settled argument. This maybe should be a settled argument, but it isn't. So the question is really, how do we get from being a controversial argument to being a more settled argument? And I'm afraid, as unpleasant as it can be, the only way to do it, in my opinion, is through debate and argumentation in the calmest possible setting, but it's not always possible. John Stuart Mill, a great philosopher, in his book on liberty, said that it is necessary to hear the other side's arguments, even if those arguments are flawed and specious. Why? Because at the very least, they help us to strengthen our own arguments. Sometimes opponents think of things that we never would have thought of, and that could be potentially holes in our own arguments. Intellectually, it's worthwhile. So this doesn't quite answer your question yet, and let me take just one more second. I don't want to hog the stage. But I actually think that events of this kind, and I think people have been very, very well behaved here. Everybody's been doing a great job. But nevertheless, I still wonder how much they achieve. I really think that we're a university, a mini course, a 3 or 4 day symposium would offer enough time and relaxation, workshops where people could come together, get to know each other, see why the other side may have illusions, maybe under some kind of false consciousness. But we can't do it even in this relatively pleasant setting. I don't think we make much progress with people applauding one set of statements and then applauding the other set of statements, and who has the louder applause and who's got the louder laughter for the contemptuous remark that I or somebody else made in response to some speech that somebody in the audience made that says something absolutely ludicrous. I mean, I've just seen it so many years going on and on and on. And I don't see that it's progress.
On a personal level, welcome and encourage debate, and I think in any time that you would like to invite somebody who's aggressively supportive of Israel's atrocities, I'm more than happy to reappear here to defend those. Now, the problem is that sometimes in issues, just because one side of the issue has been pushed so much into mainstream in a country like the United States, in terms of Israel defending itself, that does not automatically mean that somebody who takes the position that both sides are to blame is all of a sudden the enlightened person who's presenting you a nuanced argument. Sometimes there is very real injustice that should be addressed and should be talked about as such. When there was apartheid in South Africa, you did not need both sides all the time. The right person was not the person who's willing to acknowledge that there are wrongs being committed on both sides. Of course there are wrongs being committed on both sides, but there is a broader problem, and that is the problem of apartheid. There is a framework in which these exchanges of violations occur. And the context that occurs in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one of a domination of one nation over another, complete subjugation of an entire population, and to try to suggest that just because somebody's view is not using words, I remember I've been criticized for using loaded terms like apartheid and atrocities and what have you. These describe their reality, and when they do, I'm not apologetic about them. And the fact that they arouse the emotions of people who have an agenda to defend a particular position is not something that I think that gives me pause about the fact that I do take the positions that I do as strongly as I do. There is a very, very horrific, atrocious reality that Palestinians are living under. And I think that this is the primary thing for us to acknowledge. And the fact that we are participating in it is what makes all the difference. We don't send Hamas weapons. If we did, if we sent Hamas $3 billion a year in military aid so they can fire rockets at Israel, I'd say we should have an even-handed discussion about this here. But when we're supporting one side's atrocities over an entire nation, then I think that there is reason for this discussion not to be as even-handed.
We support Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia supporting Hamas. So the United States is supporting both sides in some sense.
For everybody in the panel. First of all, the word Nazi has been mentioned more than once. About a ratio of 100 to 1. To be a Nazi, it has to be 6 million to 0. That's what a Nazi is. Somebody who killed millions and millions of people for no reason. That's a Nazi. What Israel is doing is defending itself since day one, since 1948, since day one. Now you talked about humanity, and you called the Hamas a whole bunch of names. I didn't hear the word terrorist group once.
It is a terrorist group.
It is a terrorist group.
And so is the Israeli government, but yes.
You also mentioned that about half of the people that were killed over the course of time in the last operation in Gaza were civilians. And you talk about humanity. We target military, and when we say we, I mean the Israeli people, target militant groups. And yes, we give 15 minutes notice before we bomb a building, and people not only do not run away, they run up to the top of the buildings with signs, "Go away, I've seen this with my eyes." Now you talk about Hamas like it's some sort of social group, terrorist group, and not only does it not attempt to attack any military facilities, it only aims at civilians. You talk about smart weapons or smart missiles we have in Israel. You have smart people putting straps on themselves and blowing up buses in the middle of a democratic country, in the middle of Tel Aviv. Just civilians, no military. And when Israel infiltrated Gaza by foot with their infantry, they didn't even stay to fight. They ran away. No attempt has been against militants in Israel, only our civilians. And I would like an answer. How do you feel about such a group leading the Palestinians, and what it means that the Palestinian people chose such a government? What does it say about them as a people?
I feel about the Palestinian people when they choose Hamas very similarly to what I feel when Israelis choose a mass murderer like Ariel Sharon as prime minister. People choose people that we don't like. There's no question that they're problematic. Now, a serious analysis would not go through just a smattering of actions. Hamas, like the Israeli government, is many things. It's a terrorist organization. Anybody who targets civilians is automatically a terrorist organization. And by that definition, the Israeli government is a terrorist organization. You don't have to take my word for it. There's a website called Amnesty International. There's a website for Human Rights Watch. You can look on them, and you will see war crimes, crimes against humanity, torture, deliberate targeting of civilians, culture of immunity in which people being shot and killed when they're Palestinians and they're shot by Israelis, nobody investigates. These are not my things. I don't invent these things. They're a reality that Palestinians live with on a regular basis.
I didn't ask about the Israelis. I asked your opinions about Hamas.
I'm acknowledging, well, you prefaced your question with a series of arguments that were incorrect. That Israel targets militants and Hamas targets civilians. Hamas does not target anybody when they fire rockets. They're indiscriminate rockets. Direct them towards a generic town. There are military people in...
Never told fire at civilians. 3 years. Not once have I received an order.
I would ask you to please stop.
Okay, well then report that to the human rights organizations that are documenting all the other Israeli soldiers who have bombed residential areas and do continue to bomb them on a regular basis. I mean, it's rather simple and straightforward. The reason why people vote for parties that we don't like is not because they support their terrorism. The Palestinians did not vote for Hamas because they support suicide bombings, any more than Israelis voted for Sharon because they enjoy massacring Palestinian civilians. That's not why people vote for parties that you and I might dislike. They voted, in Israel, they voted for Ariel Sharon because they were concerned for their security. And they were under the illusion that somebody like Ariel Sharon would bring them security. Palestinians voted for Hamas because the Palestinians were fed up with a corrupt Palestinian authority which did not bring any results. And the reason why they could not bring any results with regards to the peace process is because Israel refused to end its occupation and continued to build more and more settlements. The Palestinian Authority was saying, hold on, let's negotiate with them. And of course, Israel's policy has been, let's continue negotiating while we continue taking more and more land. And the Palestinians were fed up with it. They decided to take a different route that conditions an agreement with Israel on an end to the occupation. These are the reasons why these parties come to power. So that's excuse me?
Militant route?
I don't, a militant route? Israel, the entire country, Israel is a militant society.
No, the Palestinians.
Yes, the Palestinians have chosen a militant route because the negotiations route did not get them anywhere, because Israel continues to occupy the Palestinian territories and refused to end the occupation in favor of a peaceful solution with them. It is actually true. It's sad. What our job is as Americans is provide the Palestinians with an alternative, so that they don't have to resort to this, is to use our influence as citizens of a democracy and a superpower that has leverage over Israel to make sure that Israel abides by international law and human rights, so that people do not have to resort to these kinds of things that you and I dislike both.
I've heard the bells chime 9, and I've promised the panelists that they would be let off the hook at some point. So I'm going to ask us to thank all the panelists and the audience, and I hope this has been an informative and useful event for you. And